Distinguished panelists, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my exceptional pleasure and honor to be a moderator of a panel at 10th Belgrade Security Forum. And I deeply regret the fact that we are not together at the moment in this conference room in Belgrade Hotel Hyatt. However, I strongly believe that that fact will not affect the quality of our today's conversation on the topic what is at stake in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that this panel will be equally productive and interesting as if we were here all together. The situation in Eastern Mediterranean is becoming increasingly complicated in the last couple of years. Historical competition between Greece and Turkey, frozen conflicts in Cyprus, disagreements regarding the sea boundaries, competing claims about energy sources in the Mediterranean Sea, unsettled issues in Israel, the question of Palestine, civil war in Libya, Turkish tough relations with its Western allies. These are just some of the elements of the complicated Eastern Mediterranean jigsaw. I have a privilege today to host distinguished speakers at this panel, which could help us to understand all of the complicated issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. I will briefly introduce them. So to begin with, Dr. Isabelle Ioannides. She's a scholar in the Department of Political Science at the Free University of Brussels and an alumna of the Europe's Futures program at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. She's currently working as a policy analyst at the European Parliamentary Research Service. She holds a PhD and Masters of Research from the Department of Peace Studies at University of Bradford and Master of Philosophy in Political Science from Sciences Po in Paris and the BA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. From 2010 to 2014, she was an advisor in the European Commission's President's Bureau of European Policy Advisors, which she joined after a research position on security governments in post-conflict societies at the Free University of Amsterdam. Our second speaker is Professor James Ker-Lindsay. He is a visiting professor at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science and the research associate at the Centre for International Studies, University of Oxford. He has written extensively on the politics and international relations of Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, and in addition to his academic work, he has a practical background in conflict resolution. From 1998 to 2000, he was the coordinator of the Greek-Turkish Forum, high-level peace support initiative, administered by the Royal United Service Institute and Peace Research Institute in Oslo. More recently, he has served as an advisor on the Cyprus issue to the United Nations Council of Europe and Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom. Professor Nikos Tsafos is a senior fellow with the Energy, Security and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he writes, speaks and oversees research on the geopolitics of energy and the energy transition more broadly. He holds a bachelor degree in international relations and economics with a minor in statistics from Boston University and MA in international relations from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Nikos advised companies and governments in over 30 countries on some of the world's most complex energy projects. He led PFC's Energy's global gas consulting practice and oversaw the firm's research on natural gas. From 2014 to 2017, he was an advisor to Alaska State Legislature on the Alaska Liquefied Natural Gas Project, and he also spent 4 years as an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. I do not want to make this introduction any longer since we have only an hour for this discussion. I would like to kindly ask all of the participants to give us the 5 minutes long introductory speech about the central topic of our panel, and that is what is at stake in the Eastern Mediterranean. We will start with Mr. Tsafos. Mr. Tsafos, the floor is yours.
The organizers for having me. It's a great honor to kick off this conversation. My background is in energy, but oddly enough, the first thing I want to say is that obviously energy is not what this is about. Energy is intersecting with and interfering with and interacting with a series of overlapping conflicts that you outlined in your opening remarks. So what I wanted to do in this opening conversation is share some thoughts on how energy might be interacting with those other conflicts. The first thing that I want to get across is the conflict over energy resources in the way that we normally define such a conflict. There are a number of discoveries that have been made in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's no dispute about who owns those resources. There are a lot of places around the world where there is a resource and two countries say, this belongs to me, and the other country says, no, this belongs to me. That's not the case in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the Eastern Mediterranean, there's a very clear delineation about the resources that have been discovered, who they belong to. It is also not fair to say that the conflict over resources has had a huge impact on the development of those resources. We tend to think of energy and geopolitics as being intertwined, but really what we've had over the last 10 years or so is a number of discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Israel, in Cyprus, in Egypt, and all those resources have been sort of developed, or if they haven't been developed, it's not because of the conflicts that we're talking about today. So that's observation number one. The second thing that I always find very frustrating when I read and hear people talk about this topic is we talk about a conflict. And it's obviously not a conflict. It is multiple conflicts. And when tensions rise, it's for different reasons between different parties based on different political, moral, legal, historical arguments. And I think it's important to break down this big conflict into smaller chunks. The way I think about it is there's a conflict over Cyprus, the sovereignty of the island, who gets to make decisions about the exploitation of hydrocarbons on the island, who gets to issue licenses on the island. If revenue comes in at some point in the future, who gets to decide how that revenue is spent? So far, there's no revenue and there's no timeline for revenue to come in, but that is still a possible source of conflict. So that's question number one. It's about Cyprus, who gets to make decisions in Cyprus. And question number two is really about maritime zones. And here, even that conflict, I think of it in three different ways. One is you have a question of Kastelloris, or a small Greek island that is a little bit further away from other Greek islands. And the Turkish view is that this island should not have really any exclusive economic zone coming from its small size and distance from the other Greek islands. And most of the arguments that Turkey makes legally are based on jurisprudence that is similar to Castellorizo, a small island far away from other islands of the same country or from the mainland. But Turkey then extends this argument to two different situations, one with Cyprus, which is not a small island. It is also an island state. And Turkey uses that same argument to claim part of the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus as belonging to Turkey. And more recently, we've seen Turkey extend the same argument towards bigger Greek islands like Crete and Rhodes. So in signing an agreement with Libya about a year ago, it made claims to areas that are much closer to Crete than they are to the mainland of Turkey. So even on the maritime zone front, we really have multiple conflicts with different political and legal justifications. Let me end on a couple of observations. I think the simplest way to explain how energy is affecting this conflict is that energy has helped create this impression in Turkey that it is being left out, that things are happening, and that Turkey is not sitting at the table where decisions are being made. In some ways, this is an accurate statement that decisions are being made and Turkey is not at the table. On the other hand, it's not clear that Turkey belongs on some of these tables because some of these tables are about decisions made in Egypt and Cyprus, or in Egypt and Israel, and it's not clear that Turkey should have any role in these. But it's also oftentimes that impression that people are making decisions without Turkey doesn't really reflect the reality because a lot of these decisions are not actually being made and they're not being made at these international forums. So I think when we think about how to de-escalate, how to create a better basis for dialogue and cooperation, our first starting point, in my view, is to try to break apart this conflict and try to think about different components. How can we best address those underlying components? So I'll stop there and we can talk more about it later on.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tsafos, first of all, for helping us to deconstruct this complicated jigsaw. As you have said, there are a lot of conflicts, not just one. And for pointing out that the energy issue is not alone and that it could not be considered without taking into account other issues. And especially thank you for mentioning the economic zones and the maritime zone and the sea boundary issue and all of those things which are connected to the energy disputes and actually with all other disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I would like to give the floor to Professor James Ker-Lindsay. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And obviously, thank you to the organisers for this very kind invitation. It is a shame, obviously, that we can't all be together, as is often the case. But nevertheless, here we are. And, I think, I obviously find, like so many of us, very, very worrying what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean at the moment. We've had a very hot summer. Hopefully a little bit of a cooler autumn now will prevail. But nevertheless, the sight of Greece and Turkey appearing at points to come very close to conflict has been something that has been extremely worrying for many of us who are long-term watchers of the region. And I think Nick's made a number of very, very good points that I think sort of really needed to be made, that the problem we have here is, as far as looking at it as a Greek-Turkish issue, broadly speaking, is that it's the way that Cyprus and the bilateral Greek-Turkish relationship are now starting to come together in a broader Eastern Mediterranean problem that I think is particularly troubling from my point of view. Now, that might seem strange because people will always assume that Cyprus has been a fundamental issue in the Greek-Turkish relationship. Yes, it has, very much as setting the mood music, if you like, for that relationship. It's not exclusively about Cyprus, but nevertheless, Cyprus has often shaped the attitudes of Ankara and Athens towards each other. But it's nevertheless remained rather different from the range of bilateral issues that have existed between Greece and Turkey in the past. And while I think many people are probably fairly familiar with the Cyprus issue, even at a fairly cursory level, I think fewer people are aware of the exact range of differences that exist between Athens and Ankara in the Aegean, for example. And I think those points about the maritime issues are very important. And I should say that I certainly don't buy into this historical hatreds argument. I've never had much time for it. The problems that we're looking at today might be compounded because people seem to think that there's a history behind it. But in actual fact, what we're essentially talking about is a problem that has been developing over the past century. Greece and Turkey actually delineated their borders quite effectively with the Treaty of Lausanne. What we've seen, though, are three major new factors which have evolved over the past century, which have changed that. And one of those was this question of the Dodecanese and Castellorizo. Many people aren't aware that the Dodecanese were actually in Italian hands until 1947. And when they were passed to Greece, it introduced a new element, if you like, in the southeast of the Aegean Sea. And this small island of Castellorizo, it's a shame we don't have a map here, but if you saw it, it sort of exists. And if you draw out a maritime zone from it, you can see very, very quickly what the problem is. But it's also about the development of international law. And that, essentially, back in 1923-24, countries were considered to have 3 nautical miles of territorial waters. That's now gone up to 12 miles. Turkey argues, well, if Greece extends its waters, then it creates an Aegean lake, a Greek lake in the Aegean, which doesn't allow Turkey to be able to send its ships through. I mean, it's actually quite... that's a very simplified version of the situation, but nevertheless, that's the view that Ankara takes. And of course, then you've got issues to do with continental shelves. So there's actually a whole range of legal issues. But the real thing that really kicks this off, if you like, is this question of energy. Because this has then made all of these issues, and especially about the continental shelf, that much more valuable to these countries in a way that probably wouldn't have taken off had it not been for the fact of discoveries. And although we like to think of this in the Eastern Mediterranean, in fact, these disputes have been going on between Greece and Turkey since the 1970s. But it is this discovery of natural gas, I think, in the Eastern Mediterranean, which has really complicated matters and meant that it's now not about territorial waters in the Aegean and around Cyprus. It's also those connecting territorial waters in the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. And as was noted, the fact that Turkey signed a maritime agreement with Libya, which I think most people would say contravened Greek territorial waters, and then Greece signed an agreement with Egypt, has really shown how this has expanded out in a very, very worrying direction. And in many ways, we can see this from where the tensions were this summer. It took place in a region that we haven't in the past tended to see these problems. So if you like, this is essentially, in a nutshell, the problem that we're now trying to deal with. Development of international law, an energy gold rush, although I think a lot of people would say, and I'm sure Nikos probably have a better view on this, as to where that's going, that has served to make this worse. But as a final note, I'd say that I think we also need to note that Greek-Turkish relations are often very cyclical in nature. Now, 20 years ago, we saw what was a very good period in relations between the two countries. And I think what needs to be said in all of this is that very often these types of maritime disputes are much easier to deal with. Obviously, if countries have got good relations with one another, there's an element of goodwill at play, there's an element of trust at play, which would allow them to sit down and talk. And I think what we're seeing here is a whole snowballing effect of a number of different factors that are coming together. And with every little bit of goodwill and trust that's lost, it makes it even more difficult to try and find settlement solutions to this. And this is where Cyprus, which I haven't really touched upon, but obviously would be keen to talk about, comes into play. So I think I'll leave it at there, just to say that this is a complex issue that has been a long time evolving, but it does seem to be this energy element that has suddenly made it all the hotter, if you like.
Thank you very much, Professor, for putting the emphasis on the issue of Cyprus and for mentioning certain other important issues such as agreement between Libya and Turkey. We will additionally discuss these issues in the later part of our today's panel. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Isabelle Ioannides. Professor Ioannides, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll pick up where James left, because since I am from Cyprus, I really wanted to maybe talk more about that, because I'll agree with both speakers. It is about natural gas, but natural gas seems more like a local affair. And there is an element of disputed continental shelf areas, because there is an issue of sovereignty, and the real problem here is the Cyprus problem. And I would say that sometimes it feels like Cyprus is being left out of the debate, and you feel it both on the side of Europe. It feels misunderstood at the moment because of the strategy that it took on at the latest European Council discussions, where it tried to link sanctions against Turkey with sanctions against Belarus, which was an unfortunate linking, truly, because it managed to put its allies, its European allies, and some of them who actually disagreed, to agree because they wanted sanctions against Belarus so much. But the problem of Cyprus is also because not only a problem that the Turkish army is on the island, but that it's very difficult to have a dialogue when one party doesn't recognize the Republic of Cyprus. And this is something that is, which is Turkey, obviously. So this is something that will come up repeatedly, I think. The second problem with dialogue, although of course I'm very much for dialogue, is to try and find the right framework within which you can have this dialogue, because so far we have tried the NATO context, which is fine when Greece and Turkey are discussing, but it's obviously not a framework within which Cyprus can discuss, since it's outside that framework. Then you have the EU framework, but obviously Turkey is less keen since it's not a member of the EU, and the relationship with the EU and Turkey has been frozen in the last years. So it's very difficult to build a dialogue within that framework. And so it's about also finding the right framework for this dialogue. When we look at the latest European Council conclusions, we can see that, again, you see this misunderstanding. While the European Council strongly condemns the violations of the sovereign rights of the Republic of Cyprus, it talks about Cyprus as if the relation between Cyprus and Turkey was a normal one, without really taking into considerations the geopolitics and the occupation of the island. Then when we look at the US involvement, I guess Nikos is going to speak about this later on in the discussion, but here as well we see a shift of things, with the US standing more on the side of Cyprus, also trying to push this broader dialogue, including Israel. And I'm wondering whether these geopolitical games are something that are going to help dialogue move forward. So I would say overall that today we're in a situation, I think also because of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, where and the role of Germany in pushing for more dialogue, where the balance is definitely not tipping towards military action, it's tipping towards a dialogue. And today we don't see anyone who could possibly benefit from such a situation. Provocation at some point was perhaps in tipping the balance in Turkey towards that, but today I believe we're really moving towards a different direction, and Germany, France, Italy, the US, the EU and NATO are not going to allow for things to escalate again in this way.
Thank you very much, Professor Ioannides. And I would like to start the second round of questions with you, if that's fine with you. So you have mentioned the role of the EU in the Cyprus. And my question would be, do you think that there is any kind of strategy of the European Union for the Eastern Mediterranean, generally speaking, but for the solvement of the Cyprus issue in particular? Does the EU have any strategy for this region and for Cyprus in particular? Professor Ioannides? I think we had
the
certain,
EU.
yes, okay, yeah, I can hear you now. I'm sorry, I think we had certain technical issues, but I can hear you now. Please continue, sorry.
I was saying that at the EU level, it's very difficult to come to an agreement about this issue of the Eastern Mediterranean because each member state obviously has its own national interests, and clearly France and Italy have different interests in the region and direct interests because of the presence of companies that are involved in the exploitation of natural gas. Then Germany obviously has a big minority, a Turkish minority in the country. The EU in general has this migration agreement with Turkey, so obviously this is another element to take into consideration, but I don't think that there is a strategy per se for the Eastern Mediterranean. As far as the Cyprus problem is concerned, well, the EU is not the framework within which the Cyprus negotiations are taking place. Obviously, they're taking place under the UN framework, and the EU has now moved, at the request of the Republic of Cyprus, moved the Cyprus issue within its regional policy as an internal issue. Of course, it will support the resolution of the problem, but its role is more about ensuring the relationship at the bicommunal level, so between the two communities of the island, and also at the level of the respect of the acquis communautaire, so that both communities actually have the same legislative framework, working with the hypothesis, obviously, that the end solution would be the reunification of the island.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that issue later on. And Professor Ker-Lindsay, I would like to ask you, having in mind that considering that we are witnessing the re-escalation of one frozen conflict in the Caucasus area, so Nagorno-Karabakh region, do you think that there is a possibility for unfortunate military escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean as well, and maybe in Cyprus in particular, having in mind the frozen conflict and the unsettled issues in the Cyprus?
Well, I think this is something that worries all of us who watch Eastern Mediterranean, not necessarily because there might be a policy in place to try and stoke military conflict. I think on the whole, even though it doesn't always look the way, Greece and Turkey are trying to be very careful when they stand up to each other, not to let that overflow into direct military action. The danger, of course, in these situations is that it's very easy for accidents to happen. And 20 years ago, I remember sort of, my first job out of university was working on this project, the Greek-Turkish Forum. And at that point, a lot of the work that the Forum was putting its activities into was looking at competence building measures. And a major area that was being explored was the idea of what sort of practical steps can be taken to try and minimize the risk of military accidents and confrontations taking place in the Aegean area. And so I think that this is something that all of us watching this situation would be very acutely aware of. It's highly unlikely that either Greece or Turkey or Cyprus, for that matter, around its waters, would want to initiate military action against another country. I mean, obviously for NATO, it would be a disaster if Greece and Turkey go into a full-out military clash. But it is extremely easy for these sorts of accidents to happen. And so I think this is the nervousness that you're watching when you see these warships. And also in the Aegean, of course, you've got a whole bunch of issues to do with territorial airspace, which also potentially, and sometimes does, lead to confrontation between Greek and Turkish military aircraft. And every few years, there's a serious accident leading to a fatality and any of those could quite easily get out of hand. So I think this is something that we do genuinely worry about, and I think keep an eye on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsafos. We have already mentioned the role of the United States, and I would like to kindly ask you if you could share with us your perspective about what is the role of is there any kind of role which Eastern Mediterranean plays in the U.S. grand strategy? We have witnessed that, well, a couple of weeks ago, the International Development Financial Corporation, the newly established institution of the United States of America, their representatives visited 4 countries or 4 towns in Europe and in Eastern Mediterranean. They have visited as well Israel and Greece besides Serbia and Kosovo. So their focus on the agenda was on pipelines, gas lines, and the building of infrastructure for energy, which might indicate that the United States are trying to involve directly in the Eastern Mediterranean issues. They are already involved, but to involve even more directly with the financial support in order to keep their priorities high on the agenda in this region. What is your opinion on the role of the U.S. in Eastern Mediterranean?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think, again, we have to break this question into different pieces, right? Because I think even before you talk about energy in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think it's fair to say that the overarching theater, which is obviously influenced by what's happening in Syria and Libya, that has created a sort of what I call a geopolitical free-for-all in the region. And that is very much, I think, a product of insufficient engagement by the United States. And it's not just this administration. This has been a bipartisan issue going back to the breakout of the 2 conflicts. So I think on the one hand, you have a sense of distance and disengagement, which creates a lot of uncertainty and opens the door for players to try to push their specific regional or local interest, and that creates conflict. So that, for me, is the overarching challenge. But when it comes to energy, you have a much clearer sense of engagement. So from the beginning, going back sort of 10 years, the discovery of these resources opened the door for countries to talk to one another and for constellation of countries that maybe didn't talk enough with each other in the past to start engaging in dialogue. The United States has been very encouraging of that dialogue. It's encouraged it both bilaterally between the US and individual countries, but it's also encouraged it multilaterally. So it's encouraged the collaboration between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel in the 3+1 format. It has supported institutionally through the East Mediterranean Gas Forum. And so the United States has been very keen to encourage whatever opportunities there are for countries to come together. Having said that, I think there are 2 asterisks after that statement. Number one, a lot of this is largely symbolic, and I've talked about this already. The East Med Gas Forum does not determine where gas is going to flow at the end of the day. It's a decision that's going to be made by the companies that are involved in these projects and what they can get approved by their boards and shareholders, what kind of risk their bankers are comfortable with. So a lot of these conversations are happening, but they're not necessarily happening in a way that directly impacts the projects and how they're developed. It more affects what I call the atmospherics. That's number one. Number two, this effort, I think quite clearly, has left sort of Turkey out. And I think there is a thirst in the region to try to find a way to sort of bring Turkey into the fold. The problem is that if you do anything right now, it seems that you're encouraging Turkish aggression. If you don't bring them into the fold, then from Turkey's perspective, that reinforces their impression that they're left out, and the only way to be let in is through aggression. So you have this really difficult puzzle of how do you bring Turkey in when, as Isabelle said, you don't recognize one of the countries in the forum? How do you bring them into the fold to have conversations without actually resolving all the issues or without appearing to encourage the aggressive actions that Turkey has taken? Let me say a final thing on economic statecraft. I think this is a very exciting element. The United States over the last 2-3 years went through a big overhaul of its geoeconomic statecraft by reauthorizing and expanding the bank and by forming the International Development Finance Corporation to replace what was previously known as OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. These are in the US arsenal that we haven't really seen applied yet to the Eastern Mediterranean. OPIC gave some money to Noble Energy for some of its projects between Israel and Egypt, but this is more a tool that is on the table but hasn't been deployed yet. So far, we haven't really seen US finance and financial institutions come in and help this region. This may change. I'm not quite sure it will, especially in today's market environment where developing energy projects is quite difficult and it's getting harder by the day. But it is something that the US has the ability to deploy, but hasn't deployed yet. And so it's something that we're definitely waiting to see if that changes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tsafos. And one additional question: when we are mentioning energy and the situation in Europe and geopolitics of Europe, generally speaking, or Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, it is somehow there is an elephant in the room which we have not mentioned, and that is Russia. Despite the fact that Russia is not the actor which could substantially influence all of the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, it is still very present, for example, in Syria. So what is the role of Russia and what is the strategy of Russia in this region from your point of view?
Yeah, I think when I think about Russia in the Eastern Mediterranean, oddly enough, I don't really think of energy. I think there is this narrative that developed a few years ago that the Eastern Mediterranean could be a source of gas to help Europe reduce its reliance on Russia, and that to stop that from happening, Russia was intervening to maybe stoke conflict or to undermine this prospect from happening. I've never subscribed to that point of view, primarily because I've never really seen the Eastern Mediterranean as playing a significant role in changing the composition of gas into the European Union. Simply put, it's just not big enough in terms of volumes to make a big impact. It could, if the gas were to be developed and find its way into Europe, make a difference in some individual countries. But overall, the volume is not particularly big to make a big impact. And I think over time, and especially as the European Union advances the European Green Deal, it becomes clearer that we should really think about this region's resources in their own regional terms rather than as what they can do for European energy security, for Europe overall. Obviously, Cyprus is part of Europe, so insofar as it affects Cypriot energy security, it affects European energy security. And so because of that, I've never seen Russian actions as having a direct motivation in energy. I think, we spend a lot of time thinking about Russian foreign policy and geopolitics in all sorts of places. And I think one can easily explain the behavior of Russia by looking at their desire to exploit vacuums, by their opportunism, their willingness or their desire to be treated as an equal by the United States and by other major powers, by their willingness to sort of take a little bit of risk, not a lot of risk, in order to have a seat at the table. And clearly they see the upheaval in the Eastern Mediterranean, an opportunity to press their interests, to maybe secure friends like in Syria that could lead to a bigger sort of military footprint in the region, and sell arms. So I don't think of that driver as being necessarily energy, but more sort of traditional geopolitics and the greater assertiveness that we've seen from Russia on multiple theaters, also extending to this theater.
Well, thank you very much for this great explanation. And Professor Ker-Lindsay, I would like to kindly ask you, having in mind that you're expert not only for Eastern Mediterranean and for Cyprus, but as well for the Balkans, and since we have a lot of audience who currently watches us online from the Western Balkans, it might be interesting to discuss, can we draw any parallels between the Eastern Mediterranean open issues at the moment and the open issues in the Western Balkans, and generally speaking between security and political dynamics in these two regions?
You know, very, very good question. And I think this is one of the things that I have actually been giving a lot of thought to recently, partly because I spent many years working on the Cyprus issue, and 30 years this year, in actual fact, I've had an association with Cyprus, so for a very long time. And having watched the way that the negotiations have evolved there, yes, I see very, very clear parallels between what we're seeing taking place between Serbia and Kosovo at the moment. And I must say that, you know, I'm very skeptical of the idea that we should be pursuing some sort of long-term normalization strategy, because I think this is one of the things that I've seen in Cyprus for many decades now. It's a very worthy idea to pursue confidence-building measures. But in my experience, the amount of time and energy that goes into trying to get these small-scale agreements to try and improve matters, and invariably they get caught up in issues of recognition, they're not implemented, that it makes a lot more sense, I think, to be aiming to go for the big picture settlement. And this sort of rather captures and keeps me caught between what we're seeing the European Union trying to do between Serbia and Kosovo and what we're seeing from the United States. I think the European Union is trying this much more gradual, incrementalist, confidence-building approach, when I think that the Americans have probably got the better idea in terms of an approach. But like a lot of others, I'm very concerned about how that US approach is being implemented. So in many ways, I think there are some very interesting parallels to be drawn between the experience of Cyprus and what we're seeing between Serbia and Kosovo at the moment, although I think the end outcome obviously will be completely different. I think the way that it's been going about at the moment, I do have some deep concerns. But can I just quickly return to that question of Russia, because I think that this is also an element that ties these two issues very closely together. And of course, you know, I think the point about Russia exploiting a vacuum is very true. And, you know, let's not forget, the last thing that is in Russia's interest is for there to be a settlement of Cyprus, or for there to be a settlement of Kosovo-Serbia. These two issues and Russia's seat in the Security Council gives Moscow influence in the Western Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. And if you resolve those issues overnight, Moscow is no longer needed. It'll be no longer needed by Nicosia. It'll no longer be needed by Belgrade. And so I think we need to be very careful and remember this and bear this in mind. And, you know, there's a lot of latent sympathy that exists in Serbia and in Cyprus towards Russia, and the belief that it'll stand and protect them. But one has to ask, well, really, what is it protecting Cyprus and Serbia against? Reaching a comprehensive settlement that will actually allow the countries to move forward, but protecting its own interests. So I do really worry about the way that Russia is often presented in these situations. And just simply from a Cyprus point of view, look, you know, I've looked at the entire history of the Cyprus problem, and I cannot see a single instance where Moscow has actually really made a concerted effort to help towards settlement efforts. Not once. It doesn't put its hand in the pocket to try and fund bicommunal activities. It's been a spoiler. It may have defended Greek Cypriot interests very narrowly, but it has done absolutely nothing for a settlement whatsoever.
Thank you very much for these excellent and very important points. And I would now like to ask Professor Ioannides. We have received one question from Mr. Danko Aleksic from Regional Environmental Center. He's asking about the role of the United Kingdom into Cyprus, and he's reminding us that the UK has 2 sovereign territories on the island of Cyprus with military presence. So he asks basically you to give some thoughts about the UK interests in the region, but of course, please feel free to discuss the issues which we have mentioned previously, the role of the US and Russia as well.
Yeah, first I'd like to react, if I may, to what Nikos and James said, because I think I think, first of all, it's highly ironic that we find ourselves in the midst of a possible conflict and definitely tensions over natural gas, which originally, when this issue came up, because exactly as Nikos said, there isn't really enough resources for this project to be viable at a European level. It was more or less conceived as a local issue, a kind of a conflict resolution issue for the entire region, for the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is where we are today, very, very far from doing conflict resolution. Then on the issue of Russia, I absolutely take the points of James, and I would say I would say Cyprus is trying to keep its doors open, since it's not a member of NATO and has no possibility, obviously, of joining NATO, since Turkey is part of NATO. It keeps its good relationships with Russia to at least have a good partner also at the UN Security Council, where Russia has been friendly to Cyprus at that level, and to diversify its sources of influence, obviously, within the realistic understanding that Cyprus as a small state obviously will not have influence ultimately on anyone, as we've seen from the decision at the European Council. Now, on the role of the UK, that's a very good question. It's a question I also had and wanted to pose to James, actually, because the UK has been the big absent in this latest phase of the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. For sure, they have the bases in Cyprus. And at the latest negotiation rounds that were in July 2017, I believe, in Krstić, Montana, there was a discussion as to what would be the future of these bases if there was ultimately a reunification of the island. But I think the UK has been bogged down by the Brexit negotiations and COVID and other issues to show much interest in what's going on right now in the Eastern Mediterranean. But maybe James has more to say about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Professor Lindsay, would you like to follow up on what Professor Ioannides just said?
Well, you know, obviously the UK has a very important role, and I think as Isabelle pointed out, we haven't seen a lot of British activity over the course of this summer, and I think that there are probably a number of very good reasons for that, not least of all, as was pointed out, Brexit is taking up so much of the British government's ability to deal with any international affairs at the moment, and also COVID. You know, we haven't been having a particularly good crisis, and you know, like a lot of other countries, are moving into a difficult position at the moment. I think two things I would say on Britain's role. First is the bases, and of course in 2004, when we had the Annan Plan settlement, the offer was on the table that if there is a settlement, then Britain will relinquish half of the territory. So at the moment, you know, and I should know this in metric, but we have 99 square miles on the island, whatever that is in square kilometres. And half of that would be relinquished in the event of a settlement. So I would assume that that's a standing offer. It has been put on the table, and it would remain there. But I think the general British stance at the moment on Cyprus, and remembering, you know, we are a guarantor power in Cyprus, so it gives us a seat at the table in any settlement negotiations, not on issues of constitution, but certainly on security matters. I think the British government's position is, look, whatever the parties can live with, the UK can live with, and would be very, very flexible in trying to do that. I mean, this is a long-term problem, and Britain actually has long-standing relations with Cyprus, not just related to the bases, but obviously there's a large British population that lives on the island. There's a large Cypriot community that lives in Britain. So there's actually an incredibly close relationship that exists between the two countries, even if not always smooth. So I like to think that relations between Cyprus and Britain, they do have their bad points, but on the whole, they tend to be quite good. And the UK obviously is steering a very, very careful path at the moment on Brexit. But if I can flip this back, I think the more interesting question for me is what's driving France in the Eastern Mediterranean at the moment. And that's something I think Isabelle would be uniquely placed on this panel to answer.
Thank you very much. Having in mind that we have only 10 minutes left, I would like to give the opportunity to our distinguished panelists to give their final word. And please, if you can just briefly address the issue of what do you think that will be at stake in the Eastern Mediterranean in the coming decade? We will start with Mr. Tsafos, please.
Well, thank you. I think that number one, obviously, is to avoid conflict. This is what we all want. I mean, James talked about this. Conflict is likely to come from an accident. We did have an incident this summer with a Greek and a Turkish frigate. Both sides chose to let that incident slide and chose not to de-escalate, and that was very positive. But when you do have a huge deployment of forces and outside force as well, for accidents, and usually the incentive structure for local leaders is not to say, oh, it's an accident, let it be. It's to sort of play up to their domestic audiences. So that, I think, is number one. If you look out 10 years, there is, I think, a thesis which I've never really subscribed to, which is that we're going to particularly use energy to bring all the countries together, and we're going to have great trade between the countries, and we're all going to be sitting at this big table, happily exchanging views and gas and money. And my experience, I'm an energy analyst, and I've seen a lot of conflicts that involve energy. My experience tells me that energy goes where the broad relationship goes. If two countries want to get together and have a good relationship, they will use energy to improve that relationship. If two countries start hating each other, they're going to fight over things. And if they trade energy, they're going to fight over energy, right? I mean, you can look at Russia and Ukraine. Whenever the political relationship is good, there's no problem with energy. When the political relationship becomes bad, energy is one of the areas where they fight. So I don't think we should sort of spend too much in lofty dreams about regional collaboration where everything is coming together and everyone is quite happy. I think that might be far-fetched. It's also not, by the way, how energy is being developed in the region, which is mostly bilateral and in smaller scale. I think the overarching goal is to create a space for these trade relations to occur when they can, to have troubleshooting when there is tension, to keep it from escalating, and primarily to recognize, and I think that's the final thing I'd like to say, is, a lot of these quarrels, we assume that there's something of value that the parties are quarreling over. And it's not obvious to me that there is. So there's a lot of argument about the East Med gas pipeline. I worked on this project, 7-8 years ago when it was first proposed. It's very unlikely that this project is going to get built. Greece and Turkey are squabbling over areas, south of the Turkish mainland and Castellori. So, even if you were to find any natural gas there, it's going to be very difficult to exploit. Far off the mainland, what do you do with this? It's most likely going to be uneconomic, and we have no idea if there's anything there. So I think keeping this perspective in mind will be very helpful in helping to bring down a notch of tension in these regional negotiations.
Thank you very much, and it is really, really not only interesting but inspiring to think about the energy through the lenses which you have now mentioned. And I think that is something that a lot of us are missing in the field of IR. When we talk about energy, we consider it to be a factor which is affecting the politics and not vice versa. So basically, thank you for that point. And yes, please, Professor Ioannides, your final remarks and just brief your thoughts about what will be at stake in the next decade in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Personally, I don't think that things will change very much, honestly. I think it's a region that cannot run away from its geography in a way. It's always going to be at this crossroad of people, cultures, and continents. And just as it can be a region of cooperation, it can be a region of friction. So we will always have this situation between possible alliances and possible tension. I don't even want to try and predict what will happen in Cyprus, because the possibility of the conflict remaining frozen another 10 years at this moment seems like a very realistic probability, unfortunately, which is extremely sad, and it's definitely not something I wish for your region. But I mean, James asked about the interests of France. So today, France has interests, obviously, which, if you look beyond even the Eastern Mediterranean, you would understand why France has this interest. So obviously, it wants to be closer to Lebanon, which it's an area where it had an influence during the colonial years. So Cyprus would be a good anchor for it. Then obviously there is the conflict between Turkey and France over Libya, since they have decided to be on opposite sides of the governments or authorities that they support. And then there's the increasing interest and sudden interest of Turkey in the Sahel region, where France is definitely the key country, the lead country acting there. So there are different fronts that are opening also with France, and France also obviously has interests in this quite limited in the end natural gas resources in the Mediterranean, and has a presence there for that as well. And I think these different interests will keep on playing between the big countries of which are members of the EU and other interested powers. And it's a country, it's a region that there's so many conflicts there which cannot be resolved in the next 10 years, which is why I'm afraid on this one I tend to see the glass as half empty rather than half full.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for mentioning the prisoners of geography thesis, as Tim Marshall would frame it. And that is probably similar for our region as well, as you have mentioned, the Western Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, but basically a lot of regions in the world. And thank you very much for putting additional emphasis on the situation in Libya. Unfortunately, maybe I failed as a moderator to put that issue higher on the agenda, and it is of the vital importance. It is essentially important for the regional dynamics in Eastern Mediterranean. However, we had only 1 hour for the discussion of all of these important topics, and we have around 2 minutes left. So, Professor Ker-Lindsay, please just briefly your final remarks.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I was going to say, which is, you sort of said, how do I see it in 10 years' time? I think it suddenly made me think of what the region was like 20 years ago, and how very, very different the constellation is today. You know, in the mid-1990s, don't forget that the best friends in the Eastern Mediterranean were Turkey and Israel. They had an exceptionally close relationship, right to defense cooperation. Meanwhile, Cyprus and Greece were known for being very pro-Palestinian, had worked extremely hard to build their relationship with the Arab world, partly in terms of a numbers game in the UN General Assembly. Nicosia and Tel Aviv had extraordinarily bad relations. I can remember that a number of Israelis would be arrested for being Mossad agents, very anti-Israeli attitudes amongst ordinary Greek Cypriots and in many ways in Greece as well. And today you're just dealing with a completely different world. You've got Turkey now vying to try and show this leadership in the Arab world, not terribly successfully. And meanwhile, there's this amazing love-in going on between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel that really couldn't be more different from what we saw 20 years ago. So I think we've seen an extraordinary transformation already, which makes me wonder, have we settled into this new constellation, or could we see a return to those days? So it's really all to play for, and very, very interesting times.
Well, thank you very much, and I would like to sincerely thank to all of the panelists for their brilliant presentations and discussions today. I have learned a lot from you today, and I know that a lot of our followers and the people and the audience which is watching us online right now has learned a lot. And this was the first day of the Belgrade Security Forum 2020, and I would like to thank you very much for respecting the time and for keeping up to the schedule. So my role as a moderator was not so hard, and I would like to thank to the audience for listening to us, and I would like to remind you that the next online session will be held on the 14th of October. Thank you very much. It was my exceptional pleasure and honor to be here with you today, and I hope that I will see you soon and hopefully here in a physical space in this conference room in Belgrade. Have a nice evening.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Are we on our own now?